bat god man. And so this is a Native American myth, but in the context of the main thing about the superhero for me is that he emerges in the context of New York City. And he's coming out of the city. And for me, the thing that he's defending is not so much law, right or wrong, as the city itself. He is defending, the superhero acts, as it were, as the immune system of New York City and emerges that way. Now with Superman, it takes him a while to fall into that role because Superman emerges almost as a Luddite. If you read the first few Superman comics, he's very violent toward machines, and if you visualize the image of the first issue of Action Comics with him on it, he's hurling at this automobile.
Right.
It's very much like a temper tantrum. And I think that Siegel and Schuster, when they created him there in the Depression, kind of felt that he was a folk hero who stood up for the populace that felt victimized by the kinds of big business interests that cities produce.
Or the industrialized society that was
created
just created.
The Depression,
right, yeah.
that put everybody in this mess, and they saw Superman as this folk hero fighting those forces. And so, if you look at who Superman's villains are, normally in the first few years, they're usually either some scientists, Lex Luthor being a classic case, or big businessmen, corrupt city officials. And so with Superman, there's a real anti-city attitude, and it takes him a while. To learn how to fly. He starts out jumping. And then gradually he falls into this role, like with Batman, of being a defender, basically the immune system of the city itself. And so I don't think that the role of the superhero from those days to the new Batman film has changed very much. And Joker is a classic example because Joker is he personifies, like you say, whatever threat there is to an immune system. In this case, the city is the thing that needs to be preserved. And Joker represents the element of chaos that tries to blow the city apart.
Or the contamination.
Exactly.
Right.
So he's like the X, and you can plug in whatever threat you want there.
Right.
And Batman's job is to defend the city, to keep it functioning smoothly. And so, I don't see the superhero, and it could be said that this is true of most of the superheroes, and that their primary function is to act as an immune system. And really what they're trying to keep out of the city is beings from the astral plane. The beings out of ancient myth that threaten the rationalism of the smooth functioning of the city. And New York is nothing if not the great atheistic metropolis that traditionally mistrusts all forms of irrationalism and New Agey, hokey stuff, the classic New Yorker attitude. And the superhero, if you look at the beings that the typical superhero fights, they're invariably, think of Spider-Man fighting the Vulture Man. The Vulture, he's this guy who has a vulture body and a human head, and that is an image straight out of ancient Egyptian myth. The Ba was pictured as a human-headed bird. And so they're basically trying to keep these ancient mythic beings from coming into the city and swamping it and pulling it back down into this pre-rational magical taboo world, that you find, for example, dramatized in M. Night Shyamalan's film The Village, which is precisely an image of the kind of horror of what New York is built against regressing back into, that way of life that is so heavily overladen with superstitious taboos that it jams up, the basic living, so it makes it so difficult for them even to make a decision about how to defend the village, when they have to, everything's an omen. And do we want to go back to that kind of pre-modern, archaic, heavily religious attitude, or do we want to keep this atheistic, highly rational civic structure functioning? And it's the superhero's job to keep that going.
And I notice in movies that when things tend to get tough in the real world, that we have a lot of movies about superheroes that come back again and again like a cycle. And people are dealing with the issues going on in the world today. They look to the superheroes as far as, when I was growing up, you had the Lone Ranger and you had Zorro on television and heroes like that. What exactly is an anti-hero?
An anti-hero is an old traditional literary type of character. Like if you think of Stanley Kubrick's film Barry Lyndon is based on a novel by William Makepeace Thackeray called Barry Lyndon, and the subtitle is A Novel Without a Hero, because Barry Lyndon, as you recall, is basically this amoral individual who's only concerned with bringing himself up in the world without having any kind of moral responsibility towards others around him for his actions. And the fact that he becomes the central hero through whose eyes we are to experience the world indicates that he's an anti-hero. He's a hero that we don't really identify with, but we're curious about how such an individual goes about building a life. And so that's the traditional literary definition of an anti-hero. It goes way back, at least to Thackeray's novel, and so that's the definition of it, at least in the traditional sense.
Right.
I don't know if you had a modern connotation in mind.
What do you see as sort of the points in film history as a sort of markers? There's a couple movies which I feel were definitely sort of mythological markers in both consciousness and society that people tend to refer back to again and again. One of those films, of course, is, I think, The Wizard of Oz, and another possibly Citizen Kane, because they each talked about certain aspects of what was going on in that period and how thought was changing and how people saw themselves in relationship to the larger whole, the spiritual whole. What are some of the other movies that you would kind of note as markers in the different eras since movies started?
One of them must surely be Godzilla, which emerges from Japan in 1954, I believe it is. And Godzilla is loosely based on an American film that came out in 1953, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, right, which is one of Ray Harryhausen's first films. And in that film, it just shows a monster coming up from the depths and attacking a city. But it seems that when the Japanese copied that, they took the plot and they put it into this atomic nuclear age context, and where the creature is created by radiation and it attacks Tokyo. And to my way of thinking, when you look at those images and you see in the original Godzilla film this monster attacking Tokyo, it isn't all that different in what he's doing than what an atom bomb would do to a city. And for me, it seems to be a sort of a post-traumatic stress way that the Japanese psyche had of dealing with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had no other outlet. The American occupation was there controlling everything, and there were certain things that they were not allowed to talk about, and the atom bomb was one of them. And so here's pop culture, which is offered to them by American culture, and they take it over very quickly. The first manga begins at about the same time with Astro Boy. And that seems to be a marker because it represents one of the first of the big giant monster movies of the 50s, and then from after that point you get all these monster movies in the 50s, and films like War of the Worlds, that version of it from George Powell's version, and you get
Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Invasion, that's a classic one of the most important, and it kicks off a whole epoch there that really doesn't settle down until the 60s, and in the 60s the horror films start to make a comeback, and you start getting the wave of the British invasion with the Hammer
film.
Yeah, exactly.
And all that, yeah.
And then it isn't really till Kubrick gets going with 2001: A Space Odyssey that the space film, the sci-fi film proper, begins to make a comeback, because he brought in this whole idea that you could spend a lot of money on the special effects and make them look so good that they look completely convincing to the eye, and that had never been really done before. I don't think that the special effects were taken all that seriously during the 1950s.
Right in that period of 67, 68, there was a couple other movies, which of Planet of the Apes and Fantastic Voyage, yes, which were very heavy laden with special effects, and I find that going in the inside of the body with Fantastic Voyage and looking at us, the journey within us as the little ship travels throughout the body of miniaturized people in a miniaturized submarine become microscopic. If you don't know anything about that film, look it up, Fantastic Voyage. And of course, the first original version of Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston, which was a very popular film in its time and really had quite an impact on society. And of course, there's many people always refer back to that movie and of course its subsequent sequels. I want to get back to this before I forget. You'd mentioned, we were talking about Japan and Godzilla. Let's go a little bit into the aspect of anime and manga, because my kids are totally obsessed with this stuff. I mean, they love this. They look at videos on the internet with the Japanese animation. Actually, one of my favorite filmmakers that I've been following recently is Hayao Miyazaki, who's did his last film was Howl's Moving Castle, and he did Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke, a couple other earlier films. He's got several other movies and a wonderful catalog. They're great family movies, by the way.
He's a great filmmaker.
And he is respected by and revered by Disney as the god of animation right now. And he's, from Japan. I hear there's a new film coming out, hopefully, I think this year or early next year from Miyazaki. What do you think is happening with this aspect of the sort of the Japanese culture and the American culture sort of, merging into this sea of anime and manga and animation, and it's a rebirth in animation in a whole new way? What do you see as some of the mythological aspects of this form of animation getting in, especially with kids? Why do you think it's so popular with kids?